Thank you. Thanks for being here tonight. My name is Laura Noe. I am one of the co-leaders of the Brantford Refugee Resettlement program here in Brantford. We're calling ourselves Helping Families Settle. We're working with IRIS in New Haven, and we have Chris George, the executive director, who's joining us tonight, who's going to share a little bit about what's going on across the world and at IRIS. And IRIS has provided us here in Brantford a tremendous list of resources and scaffolding and really a roadmap on how do you settle a refugee family. Essentially, it comes down to three types of donations. It comes down to financial donations, physical donations, things we need to set up a house, and then the donation of time. So that's the three things we're going to be talking to you all about tonight. Our first step as a co-sponsorship community partner with IRIS was to find a fiduciary. Many of the partners with IRIS work through churches. We are working with the Brantford Microfund, and Alice Lawrenson in the back. Alice, can you just wave to everybody? Alice is the brainchild behind the Microfund. So I just want to give a big shout out of gratitude for the Microfund for being our fiduciary. And because we have events like this, and you don't leave an event like this without being asked for money, if you're going to write checks, you start with Helping Families Settle, the Microfund, and then we go to IRIS. So thank you. IRIS provided us with a list of 15 committees. To date, we have 7 of those committees filled. Those committees are Administrative Contact Person, which Paula Grimm. I work with Paula at Reach a Grow. She's raised her hand to be our admin person. We are in desperate need of people to be on our housing committee. We need people to be on our apartment setup committee. We need people on the healthcare committee. We have 4 people who have signed up for the education committee, including Wanda. Wanda, you want to just give a wave? And Janet, is Janet Hartwell here? Janet, thank you. You're also on the education committee. We need people who are going to be ride coordinators, employment committee. You all have a list of those committees when you came in. So if you want to leave your contact name and number with Naja in the back, we'll be in touch with you. So IRIS has provided us with those 15 committees. That's really what our charge is. We do not get to settle a family until all those committees are satisfied and we've done all of our legwork. So that's where we're at now. So the frequent answer I give when people ask, well, when will it happen, where will they come from, is I don't know. We don't know. We've been told by IRIS that our family will probably be coming from one of 4 countries, and that might have changed since the last time we spoke. We were told they may be from Syria, Afghanistan, Iraq, or the Congo. We've added one committee to the 15 on the IRIS list, and we call it the Connection and Belonging Committee. So once our family has arrived and they're housed and they're employed and their children are in school, bus and train transportation is understood, we want to ensure that we stay connected with our new neighbors. So we have people who will invite our families out for walks and hikes, trips to the beach, and other Brantford-specific sites. So there's a woman in town, Linda Erlinger. I don't know if any of you know Linda. She's running for the RTM in the 3rd District. So Linda is not available right now because she's running for political office. So she's offered to be part of this Connection and Belonging Committee after the family is settled. So our ultimate goal, aside from settling a family here, is we want to create a community where people feel that they belong. They want to feel like Brantford is their home. We didn't just land them here and house them and walk away. And I just want you to think about, what does it mean to belong? Think about the role that we all can play in helping a family belong. Just want to pause a moment to give gratitude to the Blackstone Library. How gorgeous is this library in town? We live in a beautiful place. For the use of the space and to meet and talk. And I can think of no better place to represent democracy than a library. Everyone is welcome in a library, and everyone belongs. So we're going to hear from two people tonight, Chris George and Alia Suraj, thank you. And we'll have time for all questions at the end. So I'm going to introduce Chris. He's going to talk to us about what IRIS does to help this extraordinary humanitarian crisis and why community co-sponsorship is unique and necessary. So thanks, Chris. Do you want the mic or?
Thanks. All right, can you hear me without a mic? Yes. All right, great. So my name is Chris George. I'm the director of IRIS, Integrated Refugee and Immigrant Services. We are one of 2 refugee resettlement agencies in the state of Connecticut. We're the largest. We're based in New Haven, but we work all over the state. I'm going to begin at the beginning because when I don't, I realize at the end of my talk I've kind of left some people behind and maybe assumed too much knowledge about the subject of refugee resettlement. So I'm going to do a real quick explanation of the U.S. government refugee resettlement program, how community groups fit into that, and then how this current humanitarian crisis is impacting refugee resettlement and how you all can come to the rescue. So, you all know that there are about 26 million refugees in the world today. That number is probably going to bump up because of the crisis in Afghanistan. Refugees generally end up waiting many, many years in refugee camps in the hope of returning home, maybe integrating into the countries they fled to, or maybe being resettled in another country. And the U.S. government has, for years, historically, been the leader in refugee resettlement. Typically, we will invite 85,000 refugees a year to the United States to be resettled. The resettlement is handled by nonprofit groups like mine. There are 9 national organizations that have contracts with the State Department. They're sort of at the top tier. And then underneath those 9 national groups, you know some of them, Church World Service, International Rescue Committee, HIAS. Underneath those 9, there are 200 small nonprofits spread across the country, including IRIS. And the selection of refugees is usually done overseas. State Department and Department of Homeland Security will send personnel around the world to areas where there are refugees and interview them to make sure they meet that international law definition of a refugee, which you all know by heart because you've heard me speak before. A refugee is a person who has fled his or her home country because of persecution. That's the key. They have a well-founded fear of persecution, or they've actually experienced persecution because of their race, their religion, their nationality, membership in a certain ethnic group, or their political opinion. 26 million refugees in the world today. So, U.S. government officials will go to refugee areas. Let's say we're in the Zaatari refugee camp, the border between Jordan and Syria, and these officials will interview refugee families to make sure they meet that definition. Department of Homeland Security will then come in and interrogate them to make sure they're coming to the United States for all the right reasons. Give me all of the addresses where you've ever lived. Give me the cell phone numbers that you've ever had. List all of your friends and relatives that you can remember. Where did you go to school? Where did you work? Tell me the names of the students that you were friends with at the university in home Syria. Tons and tons of questions. Usually takes a long time. We run it through background checks, FBI, CIA, fingerprints, forensics, to make sure that the documents you produced are valid. And then at the end of this process, we don't take any chances. At the end of this process, you'll be invited to come to the United States. Now, when refugees are told that they can come to the United States, They run through a health screening process, and then they're asked usually, so this refugee family here, we would ask you, you're coming to the United States, do you have a friend or relative somewhere in the United States who could help with your resettlement? And if Muhammad here says, yes, I've got an Uncle Ahmed in Detroit, then we'll contact Uncle Ahmed in Detroit and see if he's ready to welcome this family, and if so, the family would go to Detroit. But if they don't know anyone, let's say here's another refugee family, and they have no friends or relatives in the United States, you're going to be arbitrarily assigned to any state in this country, including one you've never heard of, and you can't pronounce. You're going to Connecticut. So pack your bags. While they're packing their bags, in Connecticut, New Haven, my office, we'll get an email and it says, lovely family from Syria or Afghanistan or Congo or Iraq is arriving in 3 weeks. We usually have about 3 weeks notice. My staff, professionals, experienced, dedicated people, will then run out and try to find an apartment, negotiate with the landlord. Sometimes that's not easy. I mean, say you're a landlord. Yes, I do want to put a refugee family in that 2-bedroom apartment on Main Street. No, I'm sorry, they're not here. You can't meet them. No, they don't speak English. No, they don't have a credit history. They have an amazing history, and you'll hear about someone's amazing history later, but they don't have a credit history. I'm sorry. We ask a lot of landlords, but usually they'll say, fine, we'll rent the apartment. And then they might even cook their favorite tuna casserole and serve it to the family when they arrive. So we'll get that apartment ready, we'll furnish it with donated furniture, we'll stock the kitchen with food, we'll find someone to cook a culturally appropriate hot meal, not her favorite tuna casserole, but a culturally appropriate hot meal for the refugee family. All of this is ready. The family arrives at JFK, they're met by the United Nations, they're put in a minivan, they zip up 95, they arrive, they're met by my staff, a case manager, maybe with an interpreter, and then they're taken to their apartment, they have that culturally appropriate hot meal, they have a good night's sleep. The next day, they come in, and again, my staff will go over the program with them. We're going to connect you to healthcare, we're going to enroll your kids in school, we're going to help you learn English, we're going to help you find a job, we're going to do this as quickly as possible because we really don't get that much money from the US government, and we've got many more refugees coming. But don't worry, it'll work, and it usually does work. The kids start winning academic awards before you know it, learning English like skyrockets, parents get jobs, they begin to make their own money, depend less on IRIS for assistance, more on their own income, integrate into the community, they become self-sufficient. It's an amazing program. Now, I've just described how most refugee resettlement agencies resettle refugees in the United States, with their staff, and sometimes with a sprinkling of volunteers. But there is another way to welcome refugees. And in a way, it's an old way of welcoming refugees, where it predates the existing nonprofit system of professional refugee resettlement. It's when friends, relatives, synagogues, mosques, churches, Rotary clubs come together, just private citizens, volunteering, come together and say, we're going to welcome a refugee family to our community. And go back to 1980, before this system of refugee resettlement existed, 200,000 refugees were welcomed to the United States. 200,000 refugees were welcomed to the United States in 1980. Most of them came from Southeast Asia, and they were welcomed in a kind of informal, community-based way. And it was amazing. We've moved away from that over the past decades to a system that is, in my opinion, too professional, too limited, too restricted to just this handful of refugee resettlement agencies. Our finest foreign policy, our maybe greatest American tradition of welcoming persecuted people from all over the world and helping them start new lives should not be monopolized by a group of nonprofits. We should engage as many Americans in this great American tradition as we possibly can. And that's why in Connecticut, IRIS has kind of gone back to the old way of doing it, but improved on that. Yes, in a good way, professionalized it a bit, organized it a bit, and we call it community-based resettlement or community co-sponsorship, where an amazing group of volunteers like you all step forward and say, we want to be part of this great American tradition of welcoming refugees. IRIS, train us and show us how to do it. Help us find apartments. Teach us how to enroll kids in school. You already know how to do that. You've enrolled your kids in school. What about health care? And what are the other services that refugees need to have? Show us what to do, and we will do it and welcome a family in our community. So you will find an apartment. You'll do a furniture drive and furnish that apartment with donated furniture. You'll stock the kitchen with food using a list that IRIS has given you, culturally appropriate food for that family. You'll find someone in your neighborhood who can cook a culturally appropriate hot meal. If it's an Afghan family you're going to be welcoming, good luck. Learn how to cook an Afghan meal. Or you'll find someone who is originally maybe from Afghanistan or has got Afghan roots and they can cook an Afghan meal. You'll get all that ready. When they arrive from the airport, you will meet them. You will take them to the apartment. The next day, you will go over the program with them. Your volunteers will say, here is the chair of our healthcare committee, and he is going to make sure you've got the proper health care. Here's the chair of our education committee, 4 or 5 people on that committee. We're going to enroll your kids in school. We have 6 people working on employment. We have 8 people working on English language training. It's like an embarrassment of riches for this refugee family that you're resettling. Again, we call it community co-sponsorship because it pulls together the community. We call it co-sponsorship because you're working with us, the Refugee Resettlement Agency, in a cooperative, collaborative way, working with you all. So my first 10 years at IRIS, about 1 or 2 groups a year would come to IRIS, knock on the door and say, hey Chris, we want to become a community co-sponsor. 1 or 2 groups a year during my first 10 years. In 2016, you all remember what happened in 2016, the Syrian refugee crisis, headlines and in the news everywhere. In that year alone, 50 groups came to IRIS from across the state of Connecticut to express interest in resettling refugees. It was like this tidal wave of community interest and enthusiasm, and IRIS running ahead of it, quickly pulling together manuals and training plans and policies and procedures so that we could take advantage of this unprecedented outpouring of sympathy and interest. What's happening now as a result of the humanitarian crisis in Afghanistan dwarfs that experience from 2016. I have never seen this country, this state, you all respond with so much enthusiasm, sympathy, compassion, interest in doing something, helping out. So thank God we have a way for you all to express that, the community-based model. Not every refugee resettlement agency has embraced community-based resettlement, but believe me, today they are wishing they had. The United States State Department approached those 9 national organizations about a month ago and said, how many of these 90 or so Afghan evacuees, I call them evacuees, I know there is a technical program that they have entered the United States through called the Humanitarian Parole Program, but that's so technical, and parole and parolee, just not the right words to use. So they are evacuees from Afghanistan. So the State Department said to the 9 national refugee resettlement agencies, how many of these 90,000 do you think you could resettle? And there was a lot of angst and discussion because typically someone who comes through the humanitarian parole program is not eligible for all of those benefits that refugees are eligible for. So let's say this is a community group that has experience resettling refugees. You know that refugees are eligible for food stamps. You know they're eligible for cash assistance. You know that they all get Medicaid. And you know that they're all able to work the moment they arrive. When I say humanitarian parolee, you're thinking, I just did my homework. They don't have work authorization, and they are not eligible for food stamps, cash assistance, health care insurance. So the response from the refugee agencies was, we think we'll be able to resettle a total of about 40,000. Well, if there are 90,000 that are going to be coming to the United States, and the refugee agencies can only resettle about 40,000, what about the other 50? Community co-sponsorship. My hope is that across the United States, there will be a kind of awakening on the part of the refugee resettlement agencies that this is the way to resettle refugees. I always promoted community-based resettlement as a way to increase public support for refugees. It's also a great way for a refugee family to start a new life, but now it's a way out of this crisis. So we'll see what happens. So that's where we stand. Iris was asked, we know, they said to us, they said, oh, Iris, we know that you plan already to resettle about 400 refugees. That was before the crisis in Afghanistan happened. How many more do you think you could resettle in the year 2022? And we said, I guess we could go up to 700, from 400 to 700. We've never resettled more than 530 in our lifetime of 40 years. But because of the crisis, because we know we have your support, we were able to tell the State Department, I think we could go from 400 to 700. We might be asked to go even higher. And the only way we'll be able to do that is with community support. I just got breaking news that a government budget was passed in Washington, D.C. Did you all see that? You got the alert? It includes money to provide these Afghan evacuees with the same benefits that refugees get. So we're really happy about that. That was like a huge missing piece. With that missing piece, I hope the refugee resettlement agencies will say, you know what, I think we can go up to 60,000 or 70,000 to close that gap a little bit. So there you have it. That's an overview of where things stand. You all, there are a lot of people in this room who have experience working as part of a resettlement committee. What we look for is not just compassion in a way that's kind of a given. We look for organization and leadership and communication. I'm looking at you because you're the communicator, right? Is it you? Yes. Excellent communication with your committee and with Iris. It's not easy. It is a challenge. But when I talk to naysayers, other refugee resettlement directors around the country who say, Chris, it might work in Connecticut, but I don't think it's going to work in Kansas or Kentucky. Our volunteers just, aren't like your volunteers. Nonsense. You will find excellent volunteers who bring a lot to the table, and when you give them a lot of responsibility, they will take it seriously, and they'll do a great job. And you guys have done an incredible job. I mean, 50 groups resettling more than 350 refugees. That's amazing. So we're going to take questions later.
Yep.
So that's all I have to say for now, but I'll come back later and answer some questions. So thank you very much.
And so much of the training that Chris mentioned, that IRIS provides, is really to acclimate us to the incoming refugee families, right? So we're not here to enable this family, we want to empower them, and that's where we're going to need your help. So I want to introduce Alia. Alia, she's a marketing professional. She's a mom to 2 kids. She lives in Milford. She was born to an Afghan prince and an American hippie. Alia calls herself a Halfgan. And she'll share her story and how she advocates for Afghans and Afghanistan. So Alia, you run up.
I had to write it all down because I don't think I'm as dynamic as you are, Chris. That was amazing, and thank you. And thank you all for being here tonight. I think showing up and being willing is honestly the biggest leap to take. And now the fun work of changing lives begins. Mehman Nawazi. In English, this means hospitality. In Afghanistan, this is more than a word. It is the driving principle of the culture. Go out of your way to be welcoming. Be generous. Feed, clothe, and offer refuge to friends, strangers, and travelers, regardless of gender, religion, or race. Afghans have provided themselves on this simple act that embodies our culture. To be called Nandi means to be judged by the length of your tablecloth, or to be a host that welcomes all to your table. It is an honor. So Tashakkur, thank you for inviting me to your table tonight. My name is Alia Suraj. I am the daughter of a refugee who also happened to be an Afghan prince. He was forced to flee Afghanistan in 1978 with my American mother and 2 older sisters. I grew up in Connecticut, an American girl, in a typical and comfortable suburban life, but from a very young age, my heart has always been in 2 places, here with my American family, and far away in a place for many years I knew only through pictures and stories, an ancient, beautiful, and turbulent land. To understand the current Afghan crisis, we cannot focus on the last 20 years. To do so would ignore a history that set in motion the issues of today. So if you will, please travel back in time with me to a place far before this most recent conflict, and a people who, while bonded by some shared cultural principles and a mountainous border, have represented a large cross-culture of languages, religions, and tribes for centuries. From its inception, Afghanistan was never a definite political unit, and its people were not bound together by any identity of race or language. Afghanistan is in fact a complex society made up of over 30 different tribal groups, where Buddhists, Hindus, Sunnis, Shias, and many others besides coexisted for centuries before outsiders turned them against each other. Afghanistan has been subjected to the interests of foreign conquerors since the dawn of time, with everyone from Genghis Khan and Alexander the Great to the British, the French, and the Russians trying to lay claim to the territory. Most recently, Afghanistan took the world stage after the United States invaded in pursuit of Osama bin Laden following September 11th, 20 years ago. Afghanistan's central location and placement along the Silk Road and the spice trade routes made it an ideal setting for any would-be conqueror or empire builder to occupy. In the 19th century, Afghanistan became a pivot point in a 100-year game of tug-of-war between the British and the Russian empires for ascendancy in Central Asia. This resulted in 3 Anglo-Afghan wars between the 1830s and 1919, when Afghanistan ultimately gained her independence as a nation. The outcome of these wars set the tone for future foreign affairs of Afghanistan and gave Afghans a sense of confidence that they could defeat any foreign invader, and establishing a new sense of nationalism throughout the nation and its many tribes. One of my favorite stories as a child comes from the Second Anglo-Afghan War, when an incredible woman, a woman named Malalai, led a group of Afghan soldiers against the British. A powerful and fearless woman, Malalai chanted poetry by the British on the battlefields, and inspired by her words, the Afghan soldiers drove back the British troops to India. She led the forces on horseback, hanging her burqa on a sword. Her life is remembered as an example of courage and self-sacrifice for Afghanistan, comparable to that of Joan of Arc. And to me, she represents who Afghan women are and can be. After gaining independence in 1919, my great-uncle, King Amanullah, and Queen Soraya reigned. Amanullah was known as the Great Reformer. His reforms ranged from the emancipation of women and the banning of the veil to more rights for citizens and education reform. He was known as a modernizer across Europe. From 1920 through the mid-20th century, Afghanistan flourished in developing a modern society, with women experiencing more equal rights and access. Queen Soraya, famously removing her veil to appear side by side with her husband, founded the first women's magazine, the first women's organization, the first school for girls, the first theater for women, and the first women's hospital. Woo. And my niece is named after her. In 1964, the official constitution of Afghanistan granted women equal rights and the ability to run for office and partake in all levels of leadership. The conflict in Afghanistan, as we know it today, really began during the Cold War. Afghanistan is a strategic country during this era, as it always has been, bordering the Soviet Union, and was a key region for the containment of communism. In the 1950s, Afghanistan felt the effects of major changes happening worldwide and sought foreign assistance in arms and development to better protect itself from additional outside threats. The US declined, and the Soviet Union saw this as an opportunity to gain influence in the country, quickly providing aid such as military equipment, building roads, airports, and other infrastructure. The Soviets also helped aid to spread the communism within Afghanistan. I give you this history lesson very briefly because this is where my parents' story begins. My father, a direct descendant of the past 9 generations of Afghan kings, grew up in the mid-1900s, which seems very strange to say, during this time of modernization. He lived much of his life in Kabul, leaving in the 1960s to come study in the US here at the University of Connecticut. He was originally set to study in London, but fiercely independent as he was, he distrusted the British with their history of involvement within Afghanistan and chose instead to come to America. While here, he met my mother, a 6-foot-tall, blonde Irish-Greek hippie, the second oldest of 12 children, who was herself ready to leave that behind and go explore the world. They moved to Kabul in the early 1970s, just in time to witness the first modern coup against the royal family. In 1973, the Prime Minister peacefully overtook the palace while the king was away in Rome, under the encouragement and influence of the Communist Party. Life went on pretty normally in Kabul for the next few years, and my mother enjoyed the freedom that foreign and native women alike were experiencing. Both of my older sisters were born during this time, even as the political balance began to shift behind the scenes. And then, on one morning in 1978, my parents awoke to tanks rolling into Kabul. And before long, the communist infiltration turned on the new government, killing the now president and his entire family, and marking all royals for assassination, including my own father. In moments, my family's happy life disappeared. My father cut down the swing set in their backyard for fear that his daughter, my sister, would awake to find him hanging from its beams. My American mother pled for the ability to leave and was granted permission if she swore to leave her 2-year-old and 6-month-old daughters in the country. On a fateful night, with forged documents and a bit of otherworldly luck, my parents escaped Kabul with my young sisters on the back of a bus carrying travelers and hippies out of the country into Pakistan. Disguised with blankets and obscured by hash smoke on the back of the bus, my father made it through over 20 checkpoints on the road to Pakistan. Each one could have certainly ended his story there. Luckily for me, that was not the end of his story. And thanks to the US government and my mother's American family, my parents made it to the US with a few $100s, a new family, and everything else left behind. Over the course of the 1980s, nearly 300,000 Afghan refugees made it out to settle in foreign lands, forced to rebuild and restart, wondering if they would ever go back home again. As I grew up to learn the history of Afghanistan, its people, culture, and traditions, I too held on to that beauty and the hope that I would someday return to witness this fantastical place for myself. At 7 years old, the Soviet Union fell, and my father turned his attention toward helping his country rebuild, all the while teaching us about the Afghanistan that was and would someday be again. But the 1990s came, and the fundamentalist foreign militants now known as the Taliban rose, pushing Afghanistan and all its modernization efforts back by 200 years. This takes us to the history that we all know too well, when 20 years ago, as a sophomore at Emerson College in Boston, I watched both the country of my birth and the country of my history go up in flames. Once again, Afghanistan and her people became collateral damage of someone else's war. And once again, they sought to rebuild, this time with the aid of the US government and allied forces. During this period, I was able to visit Afghanistan twice, the first time in 2003, just after the country reopened, and again in 2010, after much of the US forces had moved elsewhere. And while devastation surrounded me on both trips, I also bore witness to the fierce resilience of the Afghan people and how they held dearly on to their customs and belief in their independence as they have for a millennia. I believed, as did my dad, that Afghanistan would rise from the ashes. Today, as I have watched the collapse of an entire society yet again over the course of the past 6 weeks, it is with much less optimism, but no less love and appreciation for Afghanistan that I look toward the future. I believe it is my mission to make sure others understand that Afghanistan is more than just a place of conflict. It is the land of Afghans, a people more complex and beautiful than I have ever known. They do not deserve the fate they have been handed, and have never been the aggressors. And I can only hope that a global lens on the current crisis will eventually drag out all forms of evil that hold the Afghan people in their grasp. Today, our focus must once again be on welcoming refugees and insisting on human and women's rights within the country. The Taliban have proven that they have not changed, and in the turn of a single generation, we have another mass exodus of refugees on the world's shoulders. It is our job to provide a better world from which Afghans will rise and grow, pursuing freedom, education, and happiness, much the same as each of us are honored to be able to do every day. For this reason, I am here tonight on behalf of my friends at IRIS and the amazing efforts of your community. I cannot begin to express how thankful I am for all of the work that you are doing for these refugees, for the work that you are doing to ensure that Afghan refugees and refugees around the world, like my father and family a generation ago, have the chance to succeed. Afghans are not the land from which they come. That land is made of Afghans. And I know, given the opportunity, they will give their resilience, their poetry, and their 1,000-year tradition of hospitality to this land in return. Thank you.
Go out of your way to be generous. What was the Afghan word for that?
Mehman nawazi.
I'm not going to try to say that, but let's go out of our way to be generous, shall we? So I would like to invite anybody who has any questions for Chris, for Alia. Yeah. Yeah. Any questions, any comments, any insights? Anybody decide they want to be on the housing committee?
Yeah.
Yes.
Good luck finding an affordable apartment.
I'm just wondering if the group has had access or will have access to other community co-sponsorship groups who can give advice to this group based on their experiences.
Are we getting advice from other, we are
Okay.
actually. Iris is fantastic with sharing the resources from around the state. So we're new at this, right? So we need all the help we can get, yeah.
Yeah, and we'll introduce you to other groups, good experienced groups, and you can just talk directly with them. I mean, we've heard, that's a common theme, comments from volunteers is, you know, we'd love to talk to other volunteers, other towns, see, you know, what they've learned, lessons learned, benefit from their experiences, you know, good and bad. So we'll definitely do that, yeah.
This is more a question for you, Laura.
Okay.
Exactly how can someone, well, let me back up. Why are we collecting money?
Okay.
And exactly how can someone donate right now?
Okay, great. So great questions. Why are we collecting money? So Iris has suggested that we raise between $8,000 and $12,000 to cover rent and other additional expenses. So when the family lands, they will not have a job. They'll have a soft landing. They'll have a nest waiting for them, and we will cover them for 4 to 6 months. So that's why we're raising the money. Secondly, you can. Oh, go ahead, Chris.
I'll jump in when you're done.
So we are accepting checks. We have the Brantford Microfund as our fiduciary. We're asking the checks be made out to helping families settle. And then if you want to put in the memo, Brantford Refugee Resettlement. Did that answer your question?
So on the budgeting, so I just spoke with a group last night in Westport, and they asked the same question. So, you know, how much money do we need to raise? It all comes down to really two things. Two key factors are the cost of the apartment, the rent, and how soon does the family start earning income through employment. Those are the two key factors. We hope that a community group does not have to subsidize rent for more than 6 months. That'd be great. But sometimes things happen. Sometimes there are obstacles. Sometimes there are barriers to employment. Sometimes there are health issues. And the community group needs to be prepared to help the family for a maximum of 12 months with their rent. How much is the rent? Well, you know, you all know better than I what rents are here, but if it's a family of 6 or 7 and you're renting a 3-bedroom apartment, that could be close to $2,000 a month. If the family's only making and bringing in through cash assistance about $1,000, your subsidy, your assistance toward that apartment is going to be $1,000 a month. And hopefully it'll only last 6 months because they're going to get a job and start, you know, paying for it themselves. But it might last longer. We are going to ask you to co-sign the lease. Now I know some of you feel like falling off your chair when I ask you to co-sign the lease. I could write a book about the joys of co-signing leases. It is not so bad. When I first started doing it in 2005, my board wanted to fire me. And then I explained to them, so where was my landlord over here? You were my landlord over here. And I said, when I'm talking to a landlord and saying, please rent this 2-bedroom apartment to a refugee family. I know they don't speak English. I know they don't have income right now. I know that you won't have a chance to meet them, and they have no credit history. And then the landlord says, well, I see you really believe in this work, and you're really enthusiastic, and you really support these people. Will you co-sign the lease? I'm going to say no. Of course I have to say yes. So we want you to show that same faith and confidence that this family is going to make it. They're not going to trash the apartment. They're not going to leave in the middle of the night and go off to Lewiston, Maine. They're going to stay and pay their rent, and you're going to help them. No problem co-signing a lease.
need to know where to send the check.
Where to send the
What
check?
is the address?
That's a good point. On the top of that
Can we pull it up
committee
here?
sheet, on the top of that committee sheet is my contact information, my phone number, and my email. If you send me an email, I'll give you an address. Okay, thank you. Thanks for asking. Appreciate that. We're figuring out all the fine details. So. Yes.
So we just found out that the government is going to send monies and help with the refugees. How does that amount of money come into? And did that happen before or not?
Yes.
And how will it influence what we need?
Good question. The State Department gives a one-time Welcome to America grant to every refugee that comes to the United States. Half of it goes towards their direct expenses, mostly rent, and the other half goes toward the Refugee Resettlement Agency to hire case managers and education coordinators and employment, job developers and things like that. It's $2,000. So say you're a single guy from Kabul, Afghanistan, you're going to get, when you arrive, $2,000. $1,000 will go toward IRIS to cover our expenses, and $1,000 will be earmarked for your rent. How long is that going to last? Not long. That is the only guaranteed government expenditure for refugees. The one-time reception and placement grant. That money is going to be given to the Brantford group. The money toward rent, and if it's a family of 6, it'll be $6,000. So that'll last a little bit longer. But once that is gone, then you're looking at employment income or cash assistance from the state. Any other questions?
I have a question. During the evacuation, the time before the evacuation, we saw a lot of military people were advocating to bring refugees out, bring them to America. They were upset with the government not doing enough. Have veterans or people from the armed services weighed in on the refugee resettlement program at all?
Have you heard from veterans groups? I mean,
I've heard the same thing from veterans, that they believe that every single person who stood side by side with Americans during their time in Afghanistan should have the right to come here and should be welcomed. In terms of how they get resettled, I don't think the conversation goes that far. I think it's just right now that we need to remove caps.
veterans are like other Americans who, in general, have never heard of refugee resettlement, unfortunately. I mean, not in Connecticut. You guys know about refugee resettlement, but most places in the country, people have never heard of it because they've never been asked to participate in it. We're changing all that now. So the veterans groups are getting a crash course now in refugee resettlement. You know, Humayun, my interpreter, for 4 years, who risked his life in Afghanistan, a veteran is saying, is now being resettled by a refugee resettlement agency in Louisville, Kentucky. And he's telling me all about it. So they're learning now. And maybe the veterans will become the kind of nuclei for community groups that form, sponsorship groups that form to welcome refugee families, maybe even the family of Humayun, the interpreter who worked with him for 4 years. So we're actually depending on veterans groups to help channel this enthusiasm, this unprecedented interest in helping evacuees. Depending on veterans groups and Amnesty International, Return Peace Corps Volunteers of America, these national groups, we're hoping that they are going to help organize sponsorship committees all over the country to welcome families. Yes?
I was seeing mention that we were focusing on Afghanistan, it seems, but that possibilities also that a family may come from Syria or Congo. do you have a sense of likelihood? I'm just wondering, because there seems to be a focus on one particular group that are coming.
Yes.
Is it overwhelming sense that it's likely because of numbers to be a family from Afghanistan to prepare for that, or is there still a possibility? I'm just curious.
You got it. There is an overwhelming sense
Okay.
that the families who will be coming to the refugee resettlement agencies, especially over the next 3 or 4 months, will be Afghan families who are now sweating it out in military bases all over the country. We thought they'd be arriving by now, but there was a measles outbreak in some of the bases, and travel was shut down for 3 weeks. But that 3-week period is ending next week, so people will start to come. We say to community groups, because we don't like to be discriminatory, we say to community groups, we'd like for you to be ready to accept any nationality. But the fact is, 90% of the people we're going to be resettling over the next 4 months will come from Afghanistan.
That's very helpful to know.
Yeah. So get out there and find Dari and Pashto speakers.
Wanda?
You know, I don't have a question, it's more just a comment and to amplify the need for people and their time to volunteer. I really thought it was the last thing I wanted to get involved with, but Laura is so persuasive and persistent and such a good person, you know, it's hard to say no. IRIS is such a fantastic organization and such a great track record, so it's hard to say no. So I'm thinking like, okay, the last meeting 2 weeks ago, I can serve on education because I've spent enough time in schools, I can deal with that. But I've learned that it's not really education. I'd like to just suggest, think of it as it's a name for a committee. It's more learning, because I realized just in the brief time I've been involved with Laura's meetings and now this one, I'm learning more than I have ever learned before about refugees. And I've been around, I've lived in foreign places, but it's fantastic. So think of it not so much as we helping, but we are too learning about this process, and learning about the people that are going to be coming here, learning about these different cultures. So it's I just want to emphasize, you know, how important it is that you can, if you can make a commitment of time, I think you'll find it really super worthwhile and fulfilling.
Wanda's on our education committee with 3 other women. Janet is here, Judith, I don't know if Judith is here, and Robin Comey, who is at a new job. Wanda and I buzzed around with Haven the other day picking up pins and different collateral material. And would you share your additional, we're all always teachers and students, right? But would you share your other idea about being in the education committee?
Well, she's saying buzzing around, we also went to Southern and met with 3 unbelievable young seniors. Are they here? Anybody? No. Including a 6'8" basketball player. This is great. But I was thinking that education is, so I was saying about learning, that just occurred to me at the beginning of this presentation, but the education was supposed to help them, you know, get into the schools and figure out the schools and this and that. So back to the learning and education, I'm suggesting to the committee and to our group that maybe part of that should be educating our community and educating the public about what we're doing. So I think events like this, and I'm sure there are many other opportunities in real creativity and oomph, we can do it. But that I think is important on our part to educate our greater community about what we're doing and what you're doing to, you know, maybe we need to get 10 families here.
And you know, IRIS does terrific training, and they'll talk about cultural humility, how we have to learn about the culture that we are accepting in. We're not just going to turn them into Americans, right? That's not the goal. My son is 22 years old, and he actually interned at IRIS this summer. And he said, Mom, I don't know if most Americans could find Afghanistan on a map, but they can tell you what Kim Kardashian is wearing. And I think to Wanda's point, I think we need to change that, right? We need to be much more sensitive we need to learn the global map.
It was the same way in the 80s. Nobody knew.
So I have a question for Alia. Back in 2016, when we were drumming up support for community co-sponsorship, inevitably, in a meeting like this, someone would stand up, raise their hand and say, you know, Chris, this all sounds really good, but aren't these Syrian refugee families going to feel isolated in Litchfield County? Or in, you know, maybe Middletown, or Madison, or Westport, or Wilton, or Fairfield, where you're placing them, there aren't other Syrian refugees around for miles. Aren't they going to feel isolated? Is this model really going to be good for them? Well, we found out that they actually did very well, Syrian refugee families. Yeah, there were one or two families that really did feel they needed to be with other Syrians, and they moved from, you know, from one outlying place to New Haven. My question probably is, how are Afghans, I know you can't generalize, every family is different, but do you worry about that when you hear us talk about this model?
I don't worry about whether an Afghan family will find their footing, whether they will thrive, whether they will integrate into the community. This is a very amazingly resilient population of people. Tribes, ethnicities aside within the country, Afghans are resilient. I worry because community and socializing and large families, it's just such a big part of who Afghans are. And, you know, lacking other Afghans in Milford, Connecticut, my father would make food for 70 on a Tuesday and just sort of open our door and say, anybody want dinner tonight? That's the kind of home I grew up in. Right. But I do believe Afghans will make a community anywhere. But wherever we can connect them to familiar communities, it's really important.
We need twice as many people on the transportation committee. Okay. Thanks.
Yeah.
We have Meg on the transportation committee. Meg, want to wave? Yeah, thank you.
That's not your
John, you have a question?
Yeah, I do have a question. I wonder if there's a need for pairing high school age students with similarly aged Afghan refugees who are coming. Is there a children's component to this?
I mean, I think that's amazing.
You're closer to high school than I am.
Still over 20 years ago, but yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting, depending on where they're coming from in Afghanistan, if they're coming from the city, if they have escaped Kabul, there's a likelihood that they speak some English. It's, you know, Afghans are overwhelmingly in the city quite bilingual, the men anyway. Maybe not as literate as they are being able to speak, but they can speak it. So I do think that peer interaction, especially among children, is awesome, right? And however you can encourage that, because it's difficult to just put a child who may not speak much English, if any at all, in a group with a bunch of other children and say, good luck making friends. It's not going to go so well. So I love that idea.
Some schools have buddy systems.
Yeah.
They did back when I was in school. A newcomer came, they were paired up with someone who, for that first week or two, helped them out. So we do two things with school-age students. We try to integrate them as much as possible so that they make American friends. But then we also give them opportunities to be among themselves. So we have an after-school program for refugee students. We have a summer school program for refugee students. We have a youth group program for young refugee men and women. So they can, express their feelings about being a refugee in Wilbercross High School among people who have similar feelings. So we do both, but that is really important.
So how does it work if you're in, let's say, in Madison, and you're supporting this group, this family? Are you involved directly with this? communicating with us? Or
Good
how
question.
does it work?
That Madison group has been really well trained. They've gone through a 6 to 8 hour training program. The core members at least have read the 35-page manual. They have gone through an application process, working with IRIS staff on certain parts of the application that we felt were a little weak and you needed to beef up a little bit. We've gotten to know you, and we trust you. You trust yourselves. You were ready for a family. We placed a family with you. So you're well prepared, that group in Madison.
How long does that take to be well prepared?
Typically between, and we're going to have to speed this up, between 2 and 6 months. I've told my staff we need to do it in 1 month. These are smart people. They can work faster. They can, deliberate and discern a little bit faster. We need more community groups to take more family. We're not going to cut corners. We're not going to sacrifice quality. We're not going to skimp on anything. I just think we can move faster. So that group in Madison is really well prepared. Doesn't mean they're not going to run into problems or have questions. I mean, everything isn't answered in that manual. You weren't trained on every single possible problem that might arise during that 6 to 8 hour training program. So there will be a problem. So your group, if it runs into a problem, you'll contact the communication person. Is that the manual? Da-da-da. You'll contact your what's your name?
Paula.
Paula. With a well-coordinated mask and top.
Yes.
Paula.
Purely by accident.
That's all right. Paula will shoot that question to Greg, our manager of the community co-sponsorship program, and try to get an answer really quickly. If Greg doesn't know the answer, he's got an incredible staff, experienced staff in healthcare and in education and employment who can get the answer, run it through Paula, who will then let the committee know. And in unusual circumstances, we might even connect the education person in the Madison committee who's having the problem and asking the question, the education person. We might connect the education person directly with Tanya on our staff who handles education for thousands of refugee kids in the greater New Haven area. So we are here to solve your problems. That's why we call it co-sponsorship. We're working together. We're not just going to bring a family to you, drop them off at the border with Madison and say, make them self-sufficient, bye-bye. No, we're in this together.
Let me ask you a little about organization of the community that I don't understand well here. Let's say the church decides to take a family, and there is all these committees here, education, health committee. How is interaction between the local entity and the community committees?
Oh, okay. So, first of all, we hope it's not just one church. There's strength in diversity, folks. We all know that. We hope that the church attracts a mosque and a synagogue and a Rotary Club and the Atheist Association of Madison. You all work together to resettle a refugee family, and you have big meetings, and maybe there's a little bit of disagreement. That's okay, that's healthy. But from this large coalition of people, you will then set up the committees. The committees then will have the different responsibilities. The housing committee will find the apartment and furnish it. The education one will be in charge of registering kids in school. And all of them, however, when they communicate with IRIS, it is channeled through that contact person. We don't want 18 people in a coalition sending separate emails to 18 people at IRIS. No, it all comes funneled through the communication person, and this person has got to be a fanatic about organization and a kind of compulsive communicator. That's what we want.
Paula is our admin person, and Paula and I work together at Read to Grow, and she writes the grants for Read to Grow. So Paula has a very special place in all of our hearts. But I think you had a question too, right?
I did have a question.
Yeah.
So this may be getting a little into the weeds, but will someone from IRIS come and help us understand cultural differences that we need to be aware of?
Yeah, and in fact, that's where Alia comes in. We'll probably ask Alia if she can help us with the cultural orientation for community groups so they're prepared
Remember, I'm
to
an
welcome.
Afghan,
Yeah.
so I'll probably call in the real Afghans.
No, you'll be fine. For example, one of the things that she'll explain to you is, and I learned this because I was a Peace Corps volunteer in the Middle East and spent about 20 years in the Middle East. She'll explain that it is considered a little disrespectful to first enter the house with your shoes on. So she'll explain, all the shoes will be at the door when you enter an Afghan's house. And then when you're sitting, you should never sit, the way a lot of Americans do and sort of point the sole of their shoe at somebody. So little things like that she'll explain. She'll explain bigger things as well. We get into some tough issues, like domestic violence. Many of the countries where refugees come from, there's corporal punishment of kids. In schools, kids are hit. And, one of the first things we have to explain to people is, you can't do that here. And so there's a lot of things that need to be explained. The other thing to keep in mind is this is a live, raw, happening crisis now for people. When your family arrives from JFK and you meet them in New Haven, I bet they're getting text messages from their friends and relatives back in Afghanistan who are in hiding, who are scared to death, and are pleading with them to please bring us to the United States.
In fact, I know that's true. I have in my phone passport images of children, of elderly people, of families, where one person is a green card holder and one person is an SIV, which is a special immigrant visa holder, and they won't leave because they won't leave their family, which is the same decision my mom made back in the 1970s. And these are families of 17, 18, 19 people, and I can't help them get out, but once they are here, we can at least help make that part easier, because that crisis isn't over for them just because they've reached our shores.
Barbara, I saw your hand too. Before you ask, I see an employee. Carly, are we okay for time? 8, okay, so we've got a couple more minutes. Okay, thank you, Carly.
We can always answer questions too if anyone wants my email address or...
Absolutely, yeah.
So this committee,
Go ahead, Barbara.
Laura, is Brantford.
Yes.
How many other committees do you have on shoreline?
How many other committees?
I mean, not you, but how many
other
other committees in our shoreline towns do we have?
I know that there's one in Madison.
Just happen to have the list right there. Brantford, Clinton, I'm going up the shoreline, Guilford, shoreline, Hampton, New Haven, Middletown, New Haven, New London, and there's Norwalk, Old Lyme.
So lots of possibilities.
Yes, there are lots, and if there isn't one, we will do the matchmaking. So if somebody says, I live in Old Lyme, I'd like to get involved in Refugee Resettlement, we'll put that person in touch with the chairperson of the Old Lyme Refugee Committee. But if there isn't one, start one. Yeah.
So in the back is Naja. Naja and Warren are in our fundraising committee. Naja's got a piece of paper, blank.
I have
If you want to fill it out, we'll be in touch with questions, any other information you want, anything you need, my name and number are on the top of that committee sheet. Maybe we'll just take one more question. Go ahead, John.
So you've several times said your family, which is a singular. So are we expecting a family, or might it be we get 2 or 3? You know, I'm trying to get my arms around what the expectation is.
Yeah, good question. I thought you were going to criticize me for using the possessive, your family.
No.
But you should. I really shouldn't. I mean, it's not, some people will say, we want to adopt a family. I say, no, it's not adoption, please. And what I mean is the family that is placed with you. It's shorthand, but we have to remind ourselves, these are adults, they're independent. The sooner they get control over their lives, the better. So we shouldn't be treating them, like children or, that you've adopted them and they're yours. So thanks for reminding me of that. The question, though, is, can a group welcome more than one family? Well, that'll be a decision that IRIS makes with you, depending on your resources. Like I said, I spoke with a group last night in Westport. They welcomed one Syrian family in 2016, but it was such a great experience. So many other people have stepped forward. I think from the meeting last night, we have 3 groups, each of which want to resettle a refugee family. So that's happening. But it depends on your resources. Let's begin with one.
And I actually like your family. I think honestly, there is something about this notion that it is easy to generalize, but when somebody is personally connected to you, any preconceived notion you have from where they came or what their background is has to be challenged. So yes, they are your family. And I love that. I think that's okay.
Well, the
So
daughter
thank you
of
all.
a prince, I am not going to disagree with.
So we're here, we need help, we have 8 work committees, we need your time. You've got my contact information. Thank you for coming out, thank you for caring, thank you for helping all of our families.
Thank you all.
along.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Connecticut is leading the way. This kind of community involvement in refugee resettlement doesn't happen anywhere else in this country. You're setting an example for the rest of the United States. So thank you.
Thank you, Iris.
Yes, thank you, Chris.
This program was brought to you in part through the support of the Town of Brantford. Watch town meetings and other videos on demand at brantfordtv.org.